The content of this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional for any health concerns. Take care of yourself out there. Welcome to Unraveling, a podcast that sees the world through the lens of mental health. I'm Kurt White, a social worker and psychotherapist.
And I'm Mary Wilson, a journalist. And on today's episode, we're very happy to have a special guest, Dr. Nnamdi Pole.
Hi, I'm Nnamdi Pole. I'm an African-American clinical psychologist and professor of psychology.
Well, thanks so much for being here with us, Nnamdi. And today, Kurt, I sort of have you in a guest role along with Dr. Pole because for years now, this will be our 6th year coming up in about a week. You have both collaborated together on a Martin Luther King Jr. event at our mental health hospital, the Brattleboro Retreat. It's held in January, about an hour-long presentation where we use some text or speech from Dr. King and relate it to what's happening in our world today. Kurt, how did we come to that?
Well, I think the idea behind wanting to do these events at all came out of, I think, a desire to recognize the work of Dr. King in the hospital. It is not an official hospital holiday for us, very few of those, generally speaking. And we wanted to sort of take up the idea that this holiday has a bit of a different kind of intention than a lot of holidays. It sort of invites us into both reflection and into service in a way. And we thought, could we look at this particular speech that I learned about from Nnamdi that was a direct link between the work that we're doing and care so much about in the mental health field and the actual words of Dr. King?
Yes, the words of the speech, and the timing of all of this was 2021. We were all like in pandemic lockdown, but we also were, as a nation and maybe even as a globe, grappling with the death of George Floyd, what it meant for Black Lives Matter. A lot of organizations were trying to think about how to act in some way to show solidarity with that movement. And Dr. King's holiday itself is in part a call to service and a call to action. And then when we look at the actual words of the speech, it was Dr. King addressing the American Psychological Association as a keynote speaker at their annual convention in Washington, D.C. And he came to them with a message. And the message was that psychologists for a long time had been writing about shortcomings in the Black community, and he wanted more focus on racism. And indeed, he says, that white America is poisoned to its soul with racism, and they need to know it, and psychologists need to study this and make this known.
Well, I feel like we came to this project with that intention, as you've described. I had no idea that this speech existed. I hadn't really known that there had been any sort of direct contact between the world of psychology and the world of Dr. King's work. And I was immediately intrigued by that.
Yeah. For us, in our efforts to recognize Dr. King within the context of the Brattleboro Retreat and its mission, I think almost every time there's been some discovery of something that King did that we were not otherwise aware of. So I think there's a way that, like, when you think about celebrating many holidays, there are established traditions, right? So we just came through the Christmas season, and whether you're Christian or not, we know about the Christmas tree. We've got the things that come on TV, we've got the routine. With Dr. King, maybe, we reference the I Have a Dream speech or certain things that maybe come to mind immediately. But what's been interesting by setting ourselves to this idea that we're going to authentically honor King through the lens of mental health, it's invited us to go find out, what did Dr. King think about these things? And it's brought us into contact with his writings, his speaking. And this one is just because the listeners may not be aware of it. Dr. King was invited to give an address to the American Psychological Association. He was the keynote speaker in September of 1967, the year before his assassination. And his main point was to kind of challenge psychologists to get involved in the civil rights movement. I guess that's the broad way to say this, is that he was aware at the time that there was a lot of social science that had come out that basically was highlighting what was sort of wrong in the Black community, Black fathers and other issues that were being criticized through a social science lens. But Dr. King noticed that there was very little analysis of the pernicious effects of racism and the harm that racism was causing. And he saw it as a real cancer in society, that psychologists were missing an opportunity to study and bring that truth out into the public. And he was really asking psychologists to get off the sidelines and get involved with the civil rights movement in this way. So that was something that I think many people don't know, and the text exists, and there was no audio recording of it, but it was published after his death.
And we took that text and that speech and then drew on that to talk about what's happening today. How radical was that idea then? And how challenging is it still within clinical work today?
Some of the images from the riots at the Capitol were ones that conjured some of the very worst moments of a not too distant racial past that would have been a present for Dr. King also, right? Lynchings and nooses set up on the Capitol lawn. It's very disturbing kinds of immediate images. And I think if we're to sort of seriously reflect on, how do we understand these things? I mean, to sort of say, well, they're political differences. That's not really what this is, I think, right? This is something that's eating away at us at probably both a social and individual level that is pernicious and rooted in history and discrimination and in this thing that is racism. And I think there has been a lot of scholarly work since then dedicated to that, although the field was kind of slow to catch up with it, but it's been a sort of ever-increasing theme in it, and one that you hear about quite a bit these days if you go to big psychology conferences or social work conferences, right? We're trying to understand the person in some of these more troubling contexts, not just as a sort of a isolated individual.
I think that's right, and I guess I can't resist saying that part of what we would do in this effort is to always think about where we are in time. So I feel like I need to mention that as we tape this, it's January 6th, 2026. So just to say, this very first event that we did, the first MLK event, was in 2021. We did it on Martin Luther King's Day, but we were just a week away from the January 6th riots that Kurt was just talking about. And that we weren't blind to that. We sort of brought that right into the presentation of where we were at that moment as we were trying to have the conversation, our very first conversation about Dr. King and what Dr. King was asking psychologists to do. So it was this really sort of powerful mixture of kind of reflecting back on Dr. King, while staying conscious of exactly what's happening right at the moment. He's always very conscious of time, and I think that's something that's worth highlighting about him that I feel like I learned.
It's interesting to reflect on the meaning of time in history in this, because I think it's there's a way in which King, like any figure, is time-bound. He's responding to the problems that are in front of him, right? And you see this in some of the speeches. The Vietnam War is happening, and he's got to, and all the wars are happening in the world now. It's a different context than the Vietnam War. And sometimes I think then on the other end of it, to sort of memorialize somebody, right, in the way you put a big statue of them and you say, well, here they are, they're an ideal or something of something. And I think it diminishes a little bit the way in which they were people like King, were brilliant individuals, but grappling with very relatable kinds of problems. And we can miss the opportunity to take some of that grappling and do a similar thing with the problems of our day. He's talking to us across time. I really have felt that in a pretty continuous way as we've dug into more and more of his works over the years that we've been doing this.
Yeah. Let's touch on that speech. Where do we go from here? And I know when we held that event, it was on the day of President Trump's inauguration. When we were planning the event, we didn't know at which point, who would win the election.
Right. Every year we've set ourselves a challenge, and I should say, by the way, my recollection of this is not that when we did the very first of these things that we sort of knew that we were always going to do these things. So for the first several years, it was a little bit of a surprise. Like, oh, we did this last year. It was so great. Maybe we should do it again. And so then the question, well, what would we do this year? And one of the first things that happened was to try to not just redo. We could have just taken the same presentation, the one about the APA and his speech, and just done it again. There's new employees at the retreat. People would have missed it. But we don't do that. Instead, we say, well, what else could we do? What could we do that speaks to this moment? And so we noticed right before the 2025 MLK Day that MLK's Day was falling on the same day as Inauguration Day. And so we knew, regardless of the outcome of the election, there was a potential, I would say, racial and civil rights meaning to either outcome. Had Kamala Harris won, it would have been a certain kind of meaning that would have been very connected to Dr. King and his legacy. And we could imagine a set of presentations that would have highlighted, King's I Have a Dream, just different things that would have led us to Kamala Harris and what the meaning of her winning would have been. Donald Trump wins, especially in light of what we just talked about the January 6th riots and the insurrection, the noose hanging at the Capitol, the imagery. It was realizing that the Trump election would be perceived by many as a civil rights blow. We were looking for what would Dr. King say? What has Dr. King said? We came upon, or it was recommended to us. I did not know about this speech called Where Do We Go From Here? So this speech was brought to my attention. And we began to look at the speech in detail. There was an audio recording available of it. We went through and dissected the audio to try to make it a manageable presentation for the 1 hour that we had, but we thought it was very resonant with the moment. And then we did the sort of audacious thing to realize that if Inauguration Day is the same day as King's Day, and given the timing of when we normally do this event, unless we moved our normal placement of this event, it was going to basically be exactly at the same time as the inauguration. And we decided to keep it at the same time as the inauguration and to basically have it be a sort of counter programming. So it had a great deal of significance. It was conscious of the moment. It was using King's actual words. It was asking a question that needed to be asked, where do we go from here? And it was asking it contemporaneously, done live, right at the moment of the Trump inauguration. So to me, a lot, happening with all of that.
There is a lot to it. Sometimes it's even just remembering a historical moment a year away. I can remember viscerally what it felt like. And I think, we've always been trying to talk to the whole audience of people that might potentially be interested in thinking about these issues of justice and equity, which I would hope is everybody, right? Which it's a national holiday. It's meant for everybody, actually. And I think one of the great heartbreaks that we've had, I think I can say I've had at least, is just how sometimes we seem very far away from that, even as a shared goal lately. And I think part of what we were trying to get at in that event is how do we hold the heartbreak of not even being on the same page about being able to talk about our ideals anymore, right? And part of what was so beautiful about finding that speech is that King it's as if he anticipates it, actually. He says there will be times, essentially, where things are going to be harder than you think they're going to be. You think this is hard, they're going to get really hard. There's going to be people that don't share the values that we have and what we're fighting for, and keep moving. Choose is a beautiful word of that. I choose love. Actually, I choose the path of love. And I don't, I get a little nervous wondering, as a therapist, do we move too far in a direction of politics? But then I read King and I think, well, I can stand with love. I'm good with that. If I have to defend that to my last breath, I'll do it. That shouldn't be controversial, right? We should all be on the side of love.
Yeah, I think that's true. And that speech also offers the hopeful idea about the arc of the moral universe, bending towards justice. That's where that can be found, and the context for that statement sort of comes from that, and we were able to kind of highlight that as well. At a time again where people might be looking for hope about where we go from here. I mean, that was really sort of, in a sense, one of the punchlines. But giving us, as you said rightfully, Kurt, giving us an expectation of setbacks and feeling disheartened and making and normalizing that to some degree, and just giving, creating a space to sort of say, we felt despair before. I mean, time is always unique, and we don't want to be lulled into the idea that we can learn too much about what's going to happen in the future from the past. But at least to be reminded that other people have suffered and have come through that suffering, and there have been better days, and all of that, I think, can be found in some of these reflections back at that era when King was alive, and putting everything on the line, knowing that his life was endangered. At the time he went to speak at APA, that was around a time when he knew, that just doing the things he was doing was putting him in personal peril, his family peril. One of the things I have been really hopeful in our work is that it would feel accessible that it wouldn't feel too ideological, so that it's impossible to connect with it. And I think King, as a civil rights figure, and when you contrast him with Malcolm X and maybe some other people, King is one that seems to be more palatable to many people, easier for people to connect with. So there's an opportunity in presenting something on King that people's ears might be a little open. They might be willing to kind of hear something coming from him. So in all of that, we don't want to squander that by alienating people unnecessarily. And I think emphasizing a message like working towards love and working towards justice, hopefully, is part of what we can do that does keep people who might be ideologically in different places having a sense of common purpose.
I remember listening to clips that you shared from that speech, the Where Do We Go From Here, and thinking, like you both mentioned, that this could have just been yesterday that someone was speaking about these sort of same principles and truths. Is it almost discouraging just how much what he said rings true today, or it's also inspiring and helpful to see it through that lens?
I think personally, I feel like if in his imagination, if Dr. King anticipated even some version of a world in which we're struggling more with things that we'd made some progress in and now we're struggling more, I feel like I'm in some pretty good company, and that there's reason to hope that things can be better, right? That the arc of the moral universe is long but bends toward justice. That it's hard when you're in the low moment of that arc, right? And things don't feel very just, but it's at least tempers the aloneness of it. And I say that as a person that, as a white clinician, a white person that suffers much less from things like racism, than the Black community and other people of color.
Yeah, and I guess what I will say about Mary, you asked a good question, and I feel like I'm of two minds. On the one hand, I think that this opportunity to look back into history, one thing about it is that I guess I was talking about the low points and the highlighting of the low points, but also it shows us that we have in the past come through those low points to better places. And I think there's a certain amount of holding us accountable for the future. I'm particularly proud of the one that we did on the I Have a Dream speech, in part because, again, with our consciousness of history, it turns out that the year we were giving that presentation on King's I Have a Dream speech was the 60th anniversary of his I Have a Dream speech. And King, when he gave that speech, gave it on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's given at the foot of the statue of Abraham Lincoln, and it's given as a kind of report card to the nation of where are we on race relations. And he goes back to what Lincoln had promised in the Emancipation Proclamation, where are we essentially 100 years later. And of course, it's a speech that is critical of how much more we have to do. But King would have noted the progress, the things that were better in 1963 than there were in 1863, right? And so I say this now in answer to your question, is that one can find encouragement in seeing that combination of being dissatisfied. And in fact, the "let us be dissatisfied" is one of the real chants that are parts of his "Where Do We Go From Here" speech, is that he's acknowledging all of the negative of where we are, but also noting that we've come a long way. We should expect setbacks, and we seem to be in one. But there's still this idea through the examination of history of the possibility of a better tomorrow. And I think that possibility is one that I prefer to lean into in these conversations.
Yeah, and your presentation on the I Have a Dream speech, which, unlike some of the other texts from MLK, is very well known, but maybe people have just listened to that speech or they know the words. How did we try to invite people to, not just listen, but reflect on our own lives and participate too?
Yeah, so we basically invited, staff at the hospital to sort of articulate their own dream, their own sort of social justice dream. So realizing that this language from King has lived on for such a long time because people really resonate with this vision for the future that he offered. And we thought a way to kind of get other people on this is to ask them to think about their own vision. So it was kind of this recognition of, to help people to feel some sense of connection to him and to articulate that. And that led many people to feel free to bring up social justice topics outside of race. For some people, they're looking for a social justice more around sexual orientation or gender identity issues. And that was an invitation for people to articulate those kinds of dreams for the future they'd like to see.
Yeah, I think it felt like a natural development of the cycle of reflections and action that we were promoting here. By moving a little bit into, away from just admiration of the idea of a speech, I think that if you really dig into the words of that speech, there's a lot more in it than the "I have a dream" line, right? I mean, there are those that have said that it's really the uncashed check speech. There's a other great line, and that's been a little bit dampened down by my history for whatever reason. It's a sort of like I'm showing up here on the Capitol to say, what is this legacy of the Emancipation Proclamation? There is still work to be done here, and it was a moment of action, right? Not just vision. Vision is important, but maybe insufficient. And I think one can linger too long in passive admiration of King's work, and taking it up doesn't necessarily have to look like a grand social project for the individual. It can look like a conversation among colleagues that's personal and immediate and sincerely felt.
Mm. And can we touch on how clinicians can address racism or bias in therapy? Does it cross a professional boundary? How would you interpret Dr. King's call to tell it like it is when applied to those relationships?
Yeah, surprisingly controversial, and maybe to some outside the field, but I think within the field, as part of our professional expectations, that there's a lot of things about that would lead us often not to feel free to confront signs of bigotry in our clients. Those are things kind of what you're asking about, right? So part of that is not therapists are often trained not to self-disclose about lots of things, including our political views. Another thing is that we are in the habit of being very accepting, and Carl Rogers and others taught us about the importance of acceptance, or accepting them regardless of behaviors that they do that the rest of the world might reject them for, whether it be any number of socially stigmatized behaviors. We therapists are in the business, like priests, of accepting people and making them feel welcome, all people. And that's dear to us. It's not like that's not just, we're not pretending that we see that that's an important part of our role. So I think when we see bigotry or something like that, it's easy to kind of put that in the same bin with all these other things. Just one more set of behaviors that, yes, the rest of the world rejects, but we have to be the safe harbor for that. On the other hand, do we miss an opportunity, especially in the context of the world that we live in, to, maybe we should address things like this. And I would say where it's come up in my own clinical work is where I see a ready connection between the clients, say, speaking of bigotry, and other problems that they have presented that they want to talk to me about it. And they may not see that connection, but one of my jobs as a therapist is to help clients see connections where they don't see them. It's not unusual for clients to come in complaining about dissatisfactions in their personal lives, relationships that aren't working, kids who don't talk to them properly, or spouses. And sometimes the way that they come across interpersonally, including their bigotry, it's a part of a way of being that's off-putting. And you as a therapist might be in a position to help them with that in a non-judgmental way, using the same skills that we do, but your choice do you let it go or do you act on it? Always having the rule of letting it go, I think is not tenable. I think that we need to critically examine it and ask ourselves, is this something we should comment on, intervene with? If so, to what end? All the same reflections we would always do in our work needs to be brought to this topic. It shouldn't be one that is just off limits, I would say, anymore.
I was thinking back to the address to the psychologists, right? It was actually a group really of psychologist researchers about what are they studying and what are they looking for. One thing that we've done in the field is that we've studied these things more. How does racism impact people? How does it impact people who are white? How does it impact people who are not white? How does it impact people who are something other than either of those things, right? And it turns out that it's quite complicated. But it isn't something that we have to shrug our shoulders about. We know that it has some effects, right? If you are in a targeted group, a sort of a group in a one-down position experiencing racism, you're much more likely to experience a variety of health outcomes and increasingly mental health outcomes that are really quite significant. And so if we're serious about trying to understand how does the world that we live in, how does the mind that we have, how do we take the best care of it in the body that the mind exists in, and all of those things, then we have to look at the things that are affecting it, right? And sometimes there are these things that are easy to see but hard to point to, I guess you could kind of say, like they're around, but where is it, how is it affecting the individual? But that we know that it is, and we know increasingly more about how it is. And so if we sort of stick our head in the sand and don't pay attention to that, how helpful are we going to be for folks that are experiencing that? And also, by the way, there is some real evidence that if you are a person suffering from having a lot of really racist beliefs, that's probably not great for you either, right? And a famous psychiatrist, Alvin Poisson, he used to make the argument that extreme versions of that should be considered mental illness, actually. That, like, if you're walking around so filled with hate and fear that you can't see straight and it makes you want to hurt other people, that's probably not a sign of health, right? He didn't persuade the American Psychiatric Association, but he tried in sincerity to persuade them. And I think it wasn't a bad argument, right? And so this is probably something kind of in the water that's affecting all of us negatively. And I think that should give us permission to notice it and talk about it with our professional hats on.
Yeah. The thing I love that, and I think I'll just add coming back to the phrase "tell it like it is." Right? I very much love King sort of putting that before scientists who put a great deal of value in pursuing truth. So I think that would have been very good bait for them, because to realize if you know something is true and you're not being honest about it, are you a good scientist? And I guess we can ask ourselves something similar as clinicians. Truth for us matters too. Helping clients have insights. So what does it mean if we're actively concealing an opinion about a client or something about the way they're behaving that we think is negative, but we're not talking about it because it's politically incorrect to talk about it? In a sense, telling it like it is, can be relieving for the client. How you do it and under what circumstances, with what rationale, so that it feels to the client not like your political agenda you're imposing on them, but rather a helpful shift of reference. Sometimes, again, for me as a Black psychologist, when I work with folks who are outside my racial group, kind of the experience they have with me might shift some of their thinking about racial prejudice and bias. So again, realizing you have a unique position as a clinician, you don't want to abuse it, misuse it, and yet you also don't want to fail to take the opportunity. There are a lot of ills in our society, and clinicians may be uniquely positioned to help people, steer them in the direction of love and compassion, to help them work through some of their beliefs that might be harmful to them and to society. So again, just opening this topic up for potential clinical exploration, really getting away from the "it's taboo" thing.
Nnamdi, I know that you, along with the DEI committee, have been working on crafting this year's presentation for MLK Day, and the topic is derogatory speech. Can you tell us a bit about why you came to that topic and maybe what we can learn about that topic from Dr. King's work?
Yeah. So what I'll say is that we at the retreat, in our work, have been wanting to work on the problem of derogatory speech, and it's connected to what I was just talking about, like the bigoted remark from the client. But the way I talked about it, I was envisioning an outpatient situation in private practice where somebody's talking about something and starts using, slurs. What's happening more at the retreat, and not just the retreat, but many other psychiatric hospitals, is when you're in the inpatient facilities, where you have people who live there, who have more serious mental illness, who may have more significant issues with reality testing and impulse control and things like that. There is use of derogatory speech from patients and clients to staff, like name calling, and it may be a special concern if there are staff of color who are, say, traveling nurses who may be working the overnight shift. I mean, there's lots of kinds of situations that make this more likely to happen. And so, again, it's not unique to the retreat. This is something I'm learning through looking at the national research is a problem in many settings. So it's come up, and it's something that we want to sort of do something about. And so we want to organize our understanding about what causes it and all these other things. But we saw the MLK presentation this year as an opportunity to put these two topics together. So we were working on derogatory speech separate from MLK, but now we want to put the two together. And just like I've been describing to you, Mary, we went to go look to see, did Dr. King have anything to say about this topic? And we found that indeed there was a letter that he wrote about 60 years ago where he explicitly talked about his views about the N-word and the harm that it causes and why it's different than other kinds of racialized words you might use. So, I won't go through all the details, but his basic point is that this word, is harmful compared to just simply calling somebody black or dark-skinned or something like that. Okay, so we want to then use Dr. King's actual words, and I'll be able to show in my presentation a copy of the letter that he wrote, which we have. The internet has made it possible for us to be able to show that letter with his signature on it, describing his views, and that will be how we set up our conversation about derogatory speech, what King would have thought about it, and then how we at the retreat might honor his legacy, his views, which are quite in line with what we're thinking about these days. That language is harmful and something we want to figure out how to minimize the presence of that language, even acknowledging that for many clients they've got very poor control over what they say and do, and so we want to do so in a mentally health conscious way, and yet also not just accept it as something that just has to be. What can you do about it?
Kurt, is this a topic that you think will resonate with the people in the mental health field?
I hope so. I think it's an interesting topic because in a place where we have inpatient units or a lot of folks maybe with certain kinds of problems with disinhibition or reality testing or that where certain kinds of behaviors might be more common, you might see these things, and yet it hasn't been talked about in people's education and training nearly as much as you might imagine, assuming it's not a new problem. What's the impact of people hearing these kinds of sort of assaults on their basic identity with these words, and perhaps over and over again? I can remember it from when I worked in long-term care back in Chicago a long time ago before I went to graduate school, that sometimes people would use this language in the context of perhaps having a mental health problem, and we're not always so amenable to correcting or discussing that or understanding the impact of it. And it created real stresses on especially my colleagues of color that were on the other side of that. It was a thing that we talked about at that time. But then I also think when people use certain kinds of language in the context of a therapy session, depending on whether or not the therapist addresses it and how they address it, is what does it mean and what impact does it have? And is it something that we bring up and talk about proactively as therapists? I think we probably should think about the language choices on the part of our patients and things like that. But it's a kind of complicated and subtle thing sometimes. So as to sort of know exactly what to do and to have, I think, the skill to do it well and in a way that is both sort of socially aware and conscious, but still sort of centers the person that we're trying to help also. So I'm really looking forward to it. I think I'll learn a lot myself from this.
I agree, and I think in what we're trying to do with this upcoming MLK presentation, a piece of it certainly will be about how to protect and take care of staff who are on the receiving end. So I just want to highlight that. So in the case of the so-called the client who says something bigoted in outpatient therapy, there's a question about like intervening with that person. Do you or do you not? But in the inpatient situation, it's like it might be that the intervention for the person who's saying these things may be limited given their ability to control themselves, but it's raising consciousness about the potential harm for staff, and not just staff of color. I just want to say that a lot of the complaints that we've heard about this come from white staff who don't want to be in an environment where they hear that kind of language. So seeing it as kind of something that creates a negative workplace environment, so this is very much brings it to like the mental health profession. How do we take care of our staff, our colleagues. When this goes on, even if this is a kind of occupational hazard, even if this is something that is going to happen, how do we make sure that we are sensitive to it in a way that people are as taken care of as possible in this situation?
Mm. And yet another example of finding one of these historical texts and sort of matching the moment to an issue that we're dealing with today. I know neither of you have claimed to be experts on Martin Luther King Jr., but if you were to sort of try to enter his mind and speak to mental health professionals in this day and age, in 2026, what do you think he would urge us to do differently with our clients, with the people we serve, or institutions, and ourselves?
I think the mental health professions have an ability to be the possibility of being a real force for good in the world. Maybe not just at the individual level, but as we accumulate a lot of knowledge about how things really work in society, across groups, including navigating the ways that we're affected by society, that we have some knowledge that if we could get it out there in subtle ways, like through psychotherapy, someone comes to us with a problem and we can help them understand their problem, or through education about, hey, this is what the research tells us about how things work, and maybe we could have a different way of approaching things at a collective level that make things better. That it has that potential for good. But I think there's also a potential for harm, right? There's a potential that the same ills of society that are oppressive become entrenched in the field, and that we, through ignorance or through not being sort of oriented to things at multiple levels of inference, like social levels, understanding things like racism, that we trample on people's I guess on their will and their sort of ability to sort of self-actualize, perhaps even if they've asked us for help. And I think that's a risk that should weigh heavy on us at the same time. And that if we could, but I think what I've learned from the writings is that I think he's asking us to hold both the ideal and our failure up to this point to live up to that ideal. And that if we can do that and live in reality, we might yet do some good.
Yeah, well said. I think that Dr. King, from I'm not an expert. I learn something new about him every year. I felt humbled at the opportunity to kind of sometimes be his voice, and that sometimes I am in the position of sort of reading his words as part of our presentations. And so, so I had tried to get inside of his head in many ways. And so, and I know that I am not really in the position to give you a very competent answer. But what I'll do is zoom in on just one thing. Is I'm thinking back to that speech that he gave to the APA where he talked about racism. And one thing he said about it, he said that he was speaking to scientists, and he said to them, people need to see that racism poisons the soul of America. Essentially, that's what that he used that phrase, soul poisons the soul. And he was speaking to scientists. We thought we're in a position to kind of reveal that truth. I would say what he might say to clinicians, coming to your point, Mary, is to find an antidote for that poison. Or, in other words, like you're the treat and you're the doctor. Treat the poison. Treat the poison. Act to resolve that poison if you're in a position to do so. I think he would want that. I think he would see that as helping people to become better people. And of course, he might go further to say, don't trample on their rights and so on, which is what Kurt and I are trying to make sure that's the professional boundary. But I think his mission would be, see that poison, treat that poison, try to cure that ill if you can. That's what he wanted to see change.
Well, this was a really great discussion, and I'm looking forward to this Martin Luther King Jr. Day and getting another wonderful presentation from you, Nnamdi. Thank you so much for joining Kurt and me on this episode.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure being here.
And I hope that people have a look at the show notes, where we're going to put some links to the speech to the APA that we've mentioned, along with some of King's other works. And with the holiday just around the corner, perhaps it will inspire you, listeners, to do some service, some reflection, some action, some discussion with others related to mental health or whatever your passions and vocations are.
Unraveling is brought to you by Brattleboro Retreat. Our producers at Charts and Leisure are Andrew Adkin, Hans Buetow, and Jason Oberholzer.
And you can find us on social media by searching Brattleboro Retreat. Brattleboro Retreat is committed to exploring diverse perspectives on mental health. While we invite hosts and guests to share their insights, the views expressed are their own and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of the hospital or its staff.